Donnybrook is made possible by the members of the 9 Network.
Hey, thanks for joining us for another edition of Donnybrook. This is the last one before the big primary on Tuesday, so lots to talk about. And we'll kick things off by meeting our panelists, starting with the news director for the Big 550 KTRS, Wendy Wiese. Hello, Wendy. Along with Mr. Bill McClellan from the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, one of our founders. Another one of our founders is now heard weeknights on KTRS, and you read him in the Riverfront Times. He's Ray Hartmann. And, of course, Mr. Kirkwood himself, Alvin Reid from 590 AM, 97.1 FM, and the St. Louis American. And for this week, we're going to start with Ray Hartmann, who, while writing for the Riverfront Times, broke a story, and that is that the county prosecutor, Wesley Belt, is going to send a matter to the U.S. attorney after some have concluded that Jerry Dobson, a local attorney representing Troy Doyle, who, of course, was someone considered for the police chief job in St. Louis County. Dobson said, hey, St. Louis County, if you don't give us $3.5 million for this discrimination suit before the primary, we'll go public. At least that's what's alleged. And you broke the story, Ray, that may go to the U.S. attorney. At the same time, the other side is saying, look, we've got some dirt on Sam Page, the county executive, who said that in a recorded interview, he controls the county police board. At the same time, he was saying he had nothing to do with the appointment of Mary Barton to that police chief job. All right, it's kind of complicated. Maybe you can sort it out, but congratulations on the scoop you had this week.
It's no big deal, but I'm not sure how to sort it out. I think the big takeaway is that the African-American community is pretty upset. There were ministers and mayors and so forth really expressing indignation about how the case with Lieutenant Colonel Troy Doyle went down. I would say this: I'd be surprised if the U.S. attorney ever calls Jerry Dobson, the attorney involved. He's I think generally well-known, respected attorney, and I just don't think that entire part of it is going to evolve. I don't think anybody knows what's going to happen with the lawsuit. I think the most interesting part of this is I think this tightens the race, because I think that a lot of people of color might be moving, from what I can tell, from away from Sam Page, and I'm going to guess a lot of those will go to Jake Zimmerman. And so I think it's good. Of course, I'm famous for predicting things wrong. I wouldn't be surprised if all three of the major candidates has a 3 in front of their number, meaning it's that close that they're all in the 30s. I really do. I think
the allegation that well maybe concerns me, and I don't know if you can prove it or not, but within what was reported was that powerful people didn't want a black police chief in St. Louis County, and that's what made the board do what it did and Page stand back and let it happen. Now, I don't know how you prove that or go about proving that, but I mean, that's the part of it all that just kind of like, well, if Sam Page was bold on Mr. Doyle until the powers that be told him not to be so bold, then I got a real problem. And it'll be after the election before we find out. So,
but Alvin, it was a 5-0 vote by the police board, and there are some pretty strong-minded individuals there, including Professor L.J. Punch of WashU. And
no, I agree.
Can you imagine her being told how to vote? I just can't see that.
No, Charlie, I agree. What I'm saying is that if we were to find out powers that be, by name, by company, by amount of money donated to people's campaign, actually voiced this concern, then, what really did happen behind the closed doors. And we really don't know, but more so than just Sam Page talking, because we don't know when he was talking or what he was talking about. I guess that would all come out at a civil trial. But the one thing is that if some names got put to some, words, I would be very interested in that.
Could I be? Go ahead, Bill. Go ahead, Bill.
I was going to say, okay, thank you, Wendy. I don't mean to be naive about things, but I don't think at this time in history you would have any white businessmen trying to tell the police board, we don't want a black leader. And the police board, this board in particular, saying, oh, okay, well, we'll not have a black leader. It sounds to me more like Sam Page was just kind of talking big that, I'm nominating the board. They'll do what I tell them. And he didn't have the control he thought he did. I'd be shocked, Alvin, if it turns out that there are some businessmen who dared to tell the board no black need apply.
And Bill, for the most part, I agree with you. But what I'm saying is, it's like all of us. I don't know what is going on in the world right now.
Yeah.
So,
Wendy, what do you think?
Wendy? The second I rule something out is the second it comes true.
I'll go flat out. I mean, Bill said he's afraid of being naive. I will go full on Pollyanna here and just throw this out for your consideration. Troy Doyle has proven himself to be really key in the police community when it comes to whether it's the hotspot policing that he had that was so successful, whether it was, in the North County when he was North County Command. Is it possible that they didn't want to? Tim Fitch, John Belmar, Steve Stanger, they all sang the man's praises. I just think it could be possible that they didn't want to throw him into the chief's office. They think maybe that he could.
That's possible. I will say, I don't think that he and Belmar got along that well.
Well, I was just going to.
I think there's that, but also what I think is a little disrespectful is that Mary Barton, who is the first female chief of the county, has 41 years of experience, and everyone's in the county and everyone's acting like, wow, how did they put her in there? She's got more experience than Doyle. She's been around longer. He's a young guy. And I think it's really kind of insulting where people are suggesting, for whatever reason, she's not fit to be there.
Okay, Charlie, I have an answer for that. First of all, Mary Barton's only, and I agree with you that Mary Barton has the qualifications. She was a captain. He was a lieutenant colonel, which is a full rank above her. He was the go-to guy. They sent in, as Wendy said, they sent him to Jennings, to North County, to fix the mess at the jail.
She was in all aspects of the St. Louis County Police Department.
Excuse me. The most she did is, by the way, I don't think there's any problem with Mary Barton except when she came out and you don't get a second chance to make a first impression. And she said there was no systemic racism in the police, which was not a great answer 2 weeks or 3 weeks.
That's her opinion.
But my point is that I think Troy Doyle, I think John, I don't think you have to believe, and I agree with Bill, that some racial edict by the corporate community to believe that people in the corporate community, for whatever reason, did not want Troy Doyle. And so I think that there's a lot more to come out on this story.
Yeah, there could be, but don't forget, sometimes you don't get it your first time around. Tim Fitch didn't make it his first time. He lost to Jerry Lee, who we recently lost. So, all right. Issue number 2. We'll go to Wendy on this one, and that is Sam Page, Dr. Sam Page, county executive, this week came out with 7 new guidelines for the county, among other things. We're going to roll back the business occupancy from 50% to 25%. Bars, you're going to shut down at 10 p.m. Businesses, this time we're really serious. We're going to crack down on you if you don't maintain social distancing, et cetera, et cetera. Teachers, we've got a place for you if you need to quarantine. What else? No more than 50 will gather. Unless there's a protest, we'll see what the county police do then. What do you say about this, Wendy?
I think that in terms of proximity to the primary, I don't think that we can overestimate the importance of that in this week for Sam Page. He's been calling quite a few press conferences. He is the acting county executive, but he is also, I think even more so, the campaigning county executive. And I was under the impression that the bars and restaurants actually were being monitored. I was under the impression that, as you said, Charlie, well, we mean it this time. We're really gonna, you know, I just took for granted that that was happening. I'm not sure. I think if anything, we talked to Dr. Marty yesterday of the Parkway School District, and I had the impression that the press conference on Monday, which addressed the revised guidelines that go into effect tomorrow, Friday, had sort of thrown all of the school districts into a bit of a state of disarray in terms of their plans and the numbers and how many people you could have in a particular setting. So I don't know what was accomplished by it or what will be accomplished by it.
Well, I thought it was kind of like in History of the World, Part 1, the Mel Brooks movie. He's got 15 commandments, and he drops one of the tablets. He said, "I got these 10 commandments." So I thought like 7. Like how do we come up with that number? He actually went farther than I thought he would, and I'm going to be honest with you. I thought that what Dr. Page would do was say we're on the verge of having to shut down again, and I'm going to give it 7 days, and on the 8th day after I win the nomination, we're going to shut down the county again. So he went a little bit farther than I thought he would, but I'm with you, Wendy. It was kind of like I thought all this was going on, and it's true for the city too. How is the city got to look on social media to see that there's 1,000 people up in the wheelhouse, cheek to cheek and gut to gut out there just, having the grand time? I thought that these things were being monitored, but obviously not. It was left up to the people's discretion, and the people decided they don't care. So I can't be mad technically at Sam Page or Lyda Cruz for saying, like, we've got to take some action because people are not taking these actions willingly themselves, or enough people are. Most of us are.
I think it's a mixed bag for him and for Lyda. But you got to, first of all, I'm not going to criticize him for this week because they're sort of like on a roller coaster, basically, and they got to listen to the numbers and the science. And quite frankly, it's a moving target. I mean, people weren't expecting the kind of spike in July that we've had, not only in the city, the county, St. Charles County. It's been very significant. And they're like riding a Bronco. I don't know how many metaphors we want to use, but they're kind of like riding a Bronco. I don't feel like, I think on one hand, the pandemic's been good for Sam Page politically because it greatly expanded his name ID. You got to remember, he's never run countywide before. And I think it really raised his profile over the last 4 months. And I'm not saying that in a judgmental way. But I think it's been very mixed as far as how he's done. I know there's this narrative that because he went to med school that was going to uniquely qualify him. I don't think it doesn't hurt. I don't think it really has shown to be a big factor. I don't think, for example, he's handled it any better or worse than Lyda Cruz. I mean, they're all in a tough position. And I don't think, we still have the worst result in the state.
Okay,
in terms of St. Louis
but
County.
let me ask Bill McClellan about an editorial that came out in the Post-Dispatch this past week, which was really, really curious. I've never seen anything quite like it, where the Post-Dispatch editorial page did said, we recommend Sam Page for county executive. But it also pointed out that his many missteps, as well as his abysmal personnel choices and his conflicts of interest. And most of the editorial was negative about Page, and yet he was endorsed.
Well, as you know, I love newspapers. I love odd endorsements. And this one was a great one. I mean, where it talked about Mantovani, and it said, we enthusiastically endorsed Mark Mantovani against Steve Stenger, and he could bring the region together, and he's a leader. And don't even get us started on Sam Page and all his mistakes. And we're endorsing Sam Page. It looked like somebody had gone in there and changed the editorial.
The last line, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it was very odd, and I enjoyed it. It's a kind of editorial that I'd go, to my, Mary, to my wife, you got to read this. So I enjoyed it. It didn't make a lot of sense.
I'd like to say something. I don't usually brag, but I am the only person on this panel who is an expert on writing bad endorsements. Okay, because I did a lot of them. I mean, they're the worst things you write. Okay, and I did a whole bunch of them, and I've never seen anything like this one. I will say this: all three candidates can use it. The problem for Sam Page is he can only use the screenshot. He can use the screenshot on TV that says we choose Sam Page. He can't afford to distribute the editorial because the only bad things in it were about him. And Mark Mantovani and Jake Zimmerman can both use it because they can take clips about how great they are out of it. So actually, the Post accomplished a deal where they wrote an editorial that all three of them can use.
But you should also, one thing, Wendy, you should also mention the St. Louis American editorial, where they endorse Sam Page because why have a lame duck or something? I mean, I didn't get that one. I enjoyed that one too.
Right. And one thing it did point out, because again, we do this, but I don't know that the general public did the math and said, like, you know what? He's just running for the last 2 years of Steve Stinger's candidacy because he's in prison. Okay. But he has to run again in 2 years. But the same thing is kind of like, well, okay, he's got to run again in 2 years. So, treading water is a good thing as opposed to drowning. But, their editorial had nobody swimming, to some goal where it was worth reaching. I don't know.
Alvin, let me go ahead, Wendy. I'm sorry. Then I'll talk to Alvin.
I have a different take on it. I think that Mark Mantovani is still very much in this race. I'm not sure about Jake Zimmerman. I know Ray thinks that he is also very much in this race.
I do too.
I could see though where the Post-Dispatch, because as Bill pointed out rightly, as usual,
thank you,
that
Wendy.
that it was a strange editorial. Well, guess what? Look around us. These are very strange times.
Absolutely.
And perhaps the Post-Dispatch is just saying, do we really want to introduce a brand spanking new administration at the County Government Center in Clayton? At this point in time, they went down the laundry list from Winston Calvert to some of his personal, traits or personality traits in terms of Page. They went down the laundry list of what's wrong with the guy. They also said, and the job that he's done as county executive, they also laid a lot of it at the feet of Steve Stenger. That he left a mess, a brush fire. I think I understand that you newspaper guys are loving this, but I think the Post did a pretty darn good job.
Oh, that's interesting. Okay, Alvin, let's go to Alvin on our next topic.
Laugh along, Bill.
A couple of weeks ago.
Wait a minute, Dad.
No, come on. Sorry, we got to move on. We're really running behind schedule here, and we do want to talk about maybe the topic that affects most people, and that's schools. Alvin Reid, it seemed like two weeks ago, the schools were saying we're going to try and go back and probably have a hybrid. Some kids will study from home. We're going to try and get most people in the classroom, and then there was a sea change over the last 14 days. The opinion and attitudes seem to go in the opposite direction. And so now we have school districts like Clayton and your Kirkwood and Webster, Parkway, Pattonville, all starting the year, not to mention the city of St. Louis and Hazelwood. They're all online. Fort Zumwalt is going to be in the classroom, but a lot of them in the city and the county, I'd say most of them are going to be online. What happened in the last 14 days?
Well, one, the numbers kept going up instead of stabilizing or slowing down. They honestly kept going up. But what happened 14 days ago, basically, and I blame the governor. The governor got out there and said, send the kids to school. They're going to get sick. They'll survive. Everybody will be right. Just send them to school. Well, you know what he does? He raises cattle. He's a farmer. And that's how they look at, animals. And I think a lot of suburban families, no matter, they might not like the mask, and they might not be conservative, all that. But they were listening to a man said like, oh, yeah, that place is chock full of COVID-19, but send your kids down there anyway. And they kind of raised their hand and said like, no matter what my feelings are about all this, you're just saying send my kids down there, and when they come home sick, it doesn't mean anything. That was the change. And I think the school districts heard it from the left, the right, and the center.
I think that's a great point, Alvin, but I think it has less to do with the governor's mansion and more to do with the White House and the fact that the state landed on this hot zone. You know, we are literally a hot zone. We can't fly into Chicago without being quarantined for 2 weeks. We've raised our profile in this pandemic world. So it might just be a mixture of both, but to find out that you're on Dr. Nancy Birx and her hot zone list from the White House Pandemic Task Force was a bit of a eye-opener, I think, for a lot of people.
I think it was the educators, not the parents. I think the educators made the decision. If you ask the parents, 67% of the parents in the county want their kids in school.
Well, I tell you what, first of all, I kind of have to agree with Wendy because Mike Parson made national news with this, well, kids are going to get COVID, get over it kind of thing. So I think he really hurt himself going forward. I think that this is such a moving target. I'm really impressed with the teachers and the administrators, how they have worked together. I know in the city, for example, very good cooperation in a crisis between teachers union and Kelvin Adams and the school and the new school board. I have really been impressed with how the educators are working together. And we've made the point here on the air, this is not one size fits all. I think Sam Page just called today for all the school districts in the county to open just before we came on. I have to tell you.
What did he ask for?
I think he's calling on all the counties to open. He's asking them to. I didn't really call for it, but
open virtually.
Virtually.
Yeah, exactly. Open virtually. And I've really been impressed with the education community.
I'll tell you, I think there's going to be a lot of collateral damage. I think there's going to be a lack of learning. I think that kids generally don't get it. We understand they don't spread it, but we're going to learn more about that in the second half when we talk to an infectious disease expert, Dr. William Powderly from WashU is going to be with us for part 2, ladies and gentlemen. But I don't know, Ray. I think that families with working parents are going to suffer. I think the kids are going to suffer by not being in the classroom, big time.
I understand that, but you have to, it's so complicated. And the concerns, these are life and death decisions. And for the teachers and for the school, all the employees at the school, I think they all, keep in mind, I'm not saying they're not coming back to school.
They want to do teachers, as you said, Charlie, think of the teachers with their underlying conditions. Dr. Fauci comes out today in an interview, or maybe it was last night, but he advised that teachers wear the face shields in the classroom.
Yeah, and I agree. But here's the thing, Wendy. I think if the teachers have comorbidities, they should be at home. They should be compensated. They should have a different role. But as we have discussed on this program, when the Great Clips hair cutters were in contact with 139 patients, and both of those Springfield and Greene County stylists had COVID-19 for 2 weeks while they cut the hair of 140 people, inches away, between 15 and 45 minutes with each client. And this is remarkable. They've been studying it at the University of Texas and Boston College and the New York Times. Not one person came down because they were wearing the masks. I think it can work.
It depends on the industry. So look at what happened with the wheelhouse. I mean, the point is, it depends on the industry. Like bars can't do it. I agree with you. Hair salons can, but it's the one.
But if hair salons can, Ray, why can't a classroom?
Well, Charlie,
the point is,
there's a saying that lightning never strikes twice in the same place. Well, it does all the time. And sometimes 3 people get struck by lightning in the same county, and it really wasn't all that stormy outside. The idea that they said that somebody didn't get coronavirus because somebody had it in the Great Clips. So that means I should send my 4th grader to an elementary school. That's North and that's South Pole, and you're a parent, and you're supposed to watch out for your kids. And even that's not watching out for your kids.
No, it is. Alvin, 2 weeks ago, 5 pediatricians from around the country were on NBC News, and they all said the kids should be in the classroom. But since then, the attitudes have changed completely.
Well, I'll tell you what, Charlie, Dr. Newland was on my show. He was one of the people, and he talked about, he's one of the smartest guys in town, Jason Newland, WashU. He said he has moved away because of following the science. In other words, you can't say what somebody said 3 weeks ago and the numbers change and you go, oh, wait, this. He's one of the best guys we've got. following the numbers, and he admits his position.
He's one guy. He's great, and he's one opinion.
But I'm
I
saying
appreciate
you
that.
can't tell all the schools what they should do. I think
But you got to admit,
they'll
guys,
come back.
you got to admit that
doing it right.
schools think alike. There's kind of a pack mentality. It comes with snow closings, and it happens.
You just think they should all
recently.
open. You just think all open?
No one wants to put their neck out. I think there's a little bit of fear of repercussions too.
Do you think they should all open?
I think that those kids whose families feel they should be in the classroom should be in the classroom. The teachers and staff without comorbidities should be in the school, and there should be great accommodations for those who can't be there, which was the hybrid plan. All right, let's go to special session on crime. Bill McClellan. Is it possible that in this state, a 13-year-old carjacker will be tried as an adult? That's, I think, one of the plans that's in front of the General Assembly right now in Jefferson City.
Well, it's inhumane to think about sending a 13, 14, 15-year-old kid to prison. But they have to do something a little stronger than the juvenile system for these carjackers, because you're getting kids, 13, 14 years old, carjacking and waving weapons around and shooting people. We got to do something. I mean, I don't think that includes sending them to Jefferson City prison, but they got to do something that they're not doing now. I mean, I'm not sure what it is, Charlie, and obviously the governor isn't. And, I don't know if Jimmy Edwards or Chief Hayden have an idea.
I think what's going on in Jefferson City now is the governor is running for re-election, and everything that comes out of this will have nothing. It'll be over after the election in November, and a 13-year-old kid in Cape Girardeau could shoot the teacher for telling him or her that he or she had to wear a mask, and they would go into psychiatric care and probably be walking the streets in 5 years. And a black kid from St. Louis would hijack a car with his finger in his jacket and be sent to prison for the next 10 years. This is a bunch of nonsense.
Hey, Alvin, the trouble they're having in the city right now isn't with kids putting their finger in their jacket like they got a gun. These are kids who have guns, and they're using the guns.
Okay, guys, we're going to have to end on that note. Unfortunately, time is up for this segment, but the good news is we're going to be joined by an expert on infectious diseases. Bill Powderly from WashU joins us in just a moment. So thank you in advance for joining us in just a moment.
Donnybrook is made possible by the members of the 9 Network. Donnybrook is made possible by the members of the 9 Network.
Well, thank you for joining us for the second half. And we're so lucky on this edition of Donnybrook Part 2 to welcome to our program the distinguished William Powderly, who is the co-director of the Division of Infectious Diseases at Washington University. And he's also the director of the Institute for Public Health at the school. Dr. Powderly, thank you very much for joining us on Donnybrook. How are you?
Very well, thanks.
Well, everybody's talking about the kids going to school or studying virtually, and just a fact, or what do we know about this disease when it comes to COVID-19? I've heard that kids spread it, and I've also heard that kids really don't spread it. What do you know about that?
So it's a complicated issue. It depends on how you define children. What we have learned is that younger children are less likely to become infected. We don't know exactly why. It may be a biological issue, but as they get older, middle school and high school, they're just as easily infected as adults are. And so very young children may not be as likely to get infected and therefore not likely to infect other people, but it isn't an absolute, it's a relative difference. And so you can't guarantee that a young child won't get it. In fact, we know that There have been cases of very young children getting it. We have been known the cases of newborns getting it. But the relative risk is lower for younger children. As they get older, they're the same as adults in terms of their risk of becoming infected. Children are much, much less likely to have symptoms, and they're much, much less likely to get sick. So from that perspective, children are in good shape. The challenge really is that children can very easily give it to their parents, to their grandparents, to others they come into contact with. And that's the danger of this particular virus.
Wendy?
It seems that underlying health conditions, this has been something of a shapeshifter, Dr. Powderly. Underlying health conditions are still right at the top, aren't they, in terms of severe reactions to COVID-19?
So actually, the biggest risk factor is age in terms of severe reactions. And the biggest likelihood of becoming hospitalized, getting into an ICU and needing a ventilator or dying is related to age. The older you are, the greater the risk. But for within any age group, the risk then also is multiplied if you have underlying health conditions, and some in particular. So diabetes and hypertension, heart disease, underlying lung disease, and obesity all seem to be factors that increase the risk of severity. They don't increase the risk of getting it, but they do mean that if you get it, you're more likely to get sick, you're more likely to end up in a hospital, you're more likely to end up in a ventilator. And that's one of the reasons why we see disparities. It's not the only reason we see disparities, but it's a big reason why we see disparities, and because these underlying conditions tend to be at a greater rate in minority populations across the country. So one of the reasons why we see a greater burden of disease in minority populations is the fact that they have more underlying conditions. Their overall healthcare, because systemic issues in our country, isn't as good.
Bill?
Doctor, speaking of disparities, the educators say that the kids in the poor districts have a harder time with virtual learning because they may not have computers, they may not have a quiet place to learn. If you were in charge of this, if we said, we'll do whatever you tell us, would you say that, well, these economic disparities are just going to have to put up with it? Or would you say, we're going to try to find some way to get poor kids into real schools?
Well, Bill, I would put it to you that we already have a problem in terms of disparities in our educational system. To compound it by virtue of the fact that in a response to a pandemic or an epidemic that's unprecedented would only make things worse. I think it's a very complicated issue, but we're not going to be able to bring kids back to school and give them a proper education if we don't invest in the resources. And the resources start at multiple levels. We've got to get, if we're going to open the schools, for example, we've got to get kids to the school, and if you happen to have a car and you can put your kid in the back of a car, that's a safer way than putting your kid in a school bus with a bunch of other kids, and it doesn't expose the bus driver either. You can go down the line, but I would put it to you that if we're in a unique situation, and there are many things that will happen that will make all of the disparities that we see across the board worse if we don't proactively start to think about how we're going to address them. And that would include ensuring that kids get the early start they need. And if it's going to be virtual, that means we have to have the resources in them being able to access those educational resources, whether it's broadband or bandwidth, in parts of the region that aren't as well served, whether it's access to computers. And, if you have a family, you're talking about every one of those children having unique access. They can't be sharing a computer. So it's a complicated issue, but I think we need to make a genuine commitment to try and fix it.
Well, of course, the problem is, Doctor, there's school starting in like 2 weeks, 3 weeks. It's kind of late to make a big commitment, isn't it?
It is. Well, it's such a rapidly changing situation that it is late. I agree with you there. It's really hard to advocate opening schools in the middle of a rising pandemic. That's for sure. And you have to have a plan B. And if the plan B is virtual, you have to do your darndest to make sure that it's going to be fair and it's not going to further discriminate against people.
Doctor, speaking of it being a rising pandemic, it felt like in June, say, we were flattening the curve a bit in the region, and suddenly July, I assume this isn't a second wave, but the first wave wasn't over, and we're seeing really big increases in the city and county, and especially in St. Charles County, which is catching up at a faster rate, sadly. How concerned should we be about these numbers we're seeing throughout July and now as we're heading into August?
So I think we should be concerned. I know certainly at the medical level, at the hospital level, we're very worried. And first of all, Ray, let me just say I agree with you. I don't think we were ever out of the first wave. I think this is a continuation of what has been going on. I think the numbers we see reflect a certain complacency and a certain weariness, I think, that people had, and a sense that, oh, it isn't that bad. And the challenge is that and as you probably know, the numbers reflect a younger population becoming positive. And I think we see that, from a sociological perspective, we see a lot of younger people out in places, gathering together in riskier situations, and older people who have a better understanding of the risk, being much more cautious. But the challenge and problem we have is that as we have more and more virus circulating in the community, we're not going to be able to protect and cocoon all of the people who are at risk. So we're starting to see a rise in the number of people in hospital and being admitted to the hospital. And our models would tell us that we are heading to where we were back in late April and May, looking at a real challenging situation again for us in over the next 3 to 4 weeks. And that's very worrying, because obviously we all know the devastation that caused. And if we don't have further attempts to mitigate this, we could get to a situation. We were fortunate in May, in April and May, we never got to what was experienced in the Northeast, in Boston and New York. But if we don't get some sort of level of control on this, we're very likely to start seeing those sort of numbers, and that will be devastating, because people will die. I mean, the challenge with this virus is that most people who get infected have at most a mild illness, but there is a substantial risk to people that and it's a crapshoot. You can't say who's going to get a bad infection, who's going to end up in hospital. We do know that as you get older, that risk is greater. So for all those young people out there who inevitably at the age of 18, you think you're immortal, they don't think there's much of a risk, and there probably is not that much of a risk to them, although we have seen young people come into the hospital. But it's their parents and grandparents that are going to be the ones that will suffer.
Doctor, you're very lettered, several degrees. I just want to tell you that I first went through Stanford in the early 90s and then Northwestern 4 years ago. And I was in a car at the time, but, but what I would, in all seriousness, different professions train to do what they do. And I just don't think, maybe with the exception of ours, which is journalism, but I've never seen a profession such as yours, where you know what you're talking about. You're trained in it. And yet you hear politicians, you hear American people say you have no idea what you're talking about. And how frustrating is that? And how do you approach that?
Well, first of all, it's incredibly frustrating. And I haven't seen anything like this in the nearly 40 years that I've been working this. I mean, I started my academic career with a different pandemic. Most of my research has been with HIV and AIDS, and there was a lot of issues. There were a lot of issues. There were a lot of concern. There was a lot of public mythology around that. But people did listen to scientists and did understand that the only way we're going to get out of it is to actually have a scientific approach. And we came up with effective treatments for HIV. We haven't come up with a vaccine or a cure, but we've come up with very effective treatments. And that didn't come out of thin air. It came from science. And I'm equally confident that science will deliver effective treatments and prevention for this virus. But it is remarkable to me how little attention is being given to the truth here. I mean, we're in a remarkable age. It isn't uniquely American, but as someone who has many contacts in other parts of the world, there's something exaggerated in the American response compared to many other countries. Scientists don't always get it right. I mean, and particularly for a new infection, a new virus, something we've only seen for 7 months. We're going to make mistakes. There's going to be a level before you set what is the absolute truth. You're going to have to learn. You're going to figure it out. But it doesn't come out of thin air, and it certainly is remarkable how many people can come up with total baloney.
Well, let me jump in there.
I like your choice of words there.
Well, right now, there is one of your colleagues at Yale University is endorsing hydroxychloroquine. He's an infectious disease expert. He's writing in Newsweek. He's on all the national shows. Yale's a relatively well-known medical school in New Haven, right? Mm-hmm. And sometimes doctors disagree. I mean, sometimes a person will go from the Cleveland Clinic to WashU for a second opinion. And sometimes the doctors change their opinions, like Leanna Wen, who might have been one of your students at WashU. She later became the director of health for the city of Baltimore, then Planned Parenthood. Earlier in the year, she was telling folks that masks make the situation worse because you touch your mask and then you touch somebody else and you make the problem worse than it was. So I think there is some reason when people may have a little skepticism.
I think there's a difference between healthy skepticism, which is, I completely agree. And I think, as I said, Charlie, we're learning too. There are issues around this virus that we made assumptions in the early days that were based on other viruses like influenza that turned out to be wrong. This virus behaves differently. And so, but part of the scientific approach is to learn from your mistakes, not to keep repeating them. And I think, and to the point where there are genuine differences between people, that's where science hopefully will lead us through the truth by what we call properly designed studies. In the case of hydroxychloroquine, what it requires are good clinical trials that will tell us what the truth is. And what is coming out now from a significant number of well-designed clinical trials is that the drug has no effect. And I think that is a majority view of infectious disease specialists now. Am I right about everything I say? Of course not. I've been wrong about things in the past. I think a certain degree of humility in everybody's case is reasonable. But I think the one thing that I would say is that, we're doing this on the basis of trying to understand what is happening with this virus and making recommendations in our best judgment. People are entitled to, say you're wrong. But if they're going to say you're wrong, I think they have to come up with an alternative explanation and not just reject science on the basis of for whimsy.
Wendy?
It is amazing, Dr. Powderly, because if there's something wrong with my automobile, I'm going to listen to a mechanic. You don't need to have your CV, as impressive as it is, to figure some of these things out. And if there is a pandemic, I think everybody on this panel, certainly at least, is going to listen to the scientist. But early on, there was some speculation published about this having something to do with blood type. I know that there are all sorts of, there's an island in Italy. We've seen, New Zealand, places with low rates of transmission. South Korea obviously got way ahead of it early on. But is there still anything being discussed when it comes to that blood type issue?
Yeah, you're right. I mean, early on, there was some evidence, some studies that suggested that you were less likely to have more aggressive disease if you had type O blood. One of the things that I think you've probably seen in the last 6 months is that the press is avid for data and for studies. And so a lot of studies that are of moderate quality get picked up, and with the access that we have through the internet and otherwise, they get widely publicized. And that's what's happened with things. So what has happened as more and more information comes in, as studies get larger and they're better done, you get closer to what is probably the truth. And so the more recent data with larger numbers suggests that there is no protective effect from one particular blood type. It was not an unreasonable suggestion, though, because we have to try and figure out and explain, why do some people get really bad infections and some people don't? It's probably genetic. It's probably related to how you as a person respond to the virus. And that's almost certainly related to your genes, so you can blame your parents. But the reality is that we don't know. We don't know yet why certain people have worse infections. Our leading guess, as I said, is that it's related to genetics, and obviously blood type is a very broad genetic trait that people have. So it wasn't an unreasonable suggestion. It's just it hasn't panned out in larger studies.
Doctor, I know we are where we are politically, but how do you go forward? I mean, like, you live in Missouri. We got a governor who doesn't want to wear his dang mask, as he says. I mean, how does somebody like you try to convince people? I mean, how should we get from where we are to where people are listening to the science when people don't trust the media or the science?
Yeah, it's a challenge. I mean, I think first of all, I think we as scientists have to partner with people like you who are better communicators, or at least understand communication better than we. I think, human narrative is important to humans. Telling a story is, as an Irishman, I'll tell you, telling a story is always the way to try and persuade somebody to get something done. To me, for example, one of the great stories that has come out of Missouri around this is what happened in Springfield and the hair salon. There you had, 2 people who were infected, and they had 150 clients, and not a single person was infected. They didn't spread it to anybody because they were both wearing masks, and most of their clients wore masks as well. Well, that may be an anecdote, but it's probably more persuasive to most people than me giving a bunch of statistics. And I think we've got to We, you know, you can give up on the political system, but it is what it is. We have to live in it. And I think we just have to keep working at saying this is the only thing we have right now to help us control this virus are masks and social distancing and being sensible and caring about other people. Because, you know, to me, wearing a mask or not wearing a mask is not a constitutional issue. It's about whether you care enough about other people that you don't want them to become infected.
Doctor, I think I saw an infection rate that was north of 9% in Missouri recently. How much danger are we in Missouri of becoming the next Florida or Arizona or Texas? We're clearly on Dr. Birx's 21, the red zone list or whatever it is. How could, I mean, and we don't seem to have any appetite for a statewide mask order, which has been in effect in a lot of states, and nobody can figure out how that became. I don't think many people can figure out why that should be a political issue. What are you? How concerned should we be right now in real time about Missouri?
I think it's a very legitimate concern. I mean, we're going in the wrong direction. You know, we may be, the numbers the last few days, the numbers have been stable. They haven't been going up. Maybe we're at that peak, but a peak is not a good place to be. It's still a high number, and as I said earlier, you know, it's one thing to have high numbers of infection. And what really worries people like me is that will translate to, you know, 2 to 3 weeks, 4 weeks from now, and you're seeing this in Florida, to people dying, and that's what really matters. Well, it is partially what really matters. The other part of it is we're starting to see more data now coming out about long-term complications of this virus, even in people who had relatively mild illness. So we're seeing issues around cardiac problems, long-term lung problems, potentially neurological problems. And I really worry that is also end up going to be even further exacerbating the disparities we see. Because, you know, if you already have the virus affecting minority populations, poorer populations at a greater rate, and, you know, unless we hope, maybe we will change things on the 4th and vote for Medicaid expansion, but unless we do something like that, we're going to be in a situation where people who need it still won't have the access to healthcare.
Doctor, I could be wrong, but my guess is you're not a believer in we have alien DNA, and sex with demons has something to do with this whole coronavirus, who the Yale doctor seems to be standing with on the Supreme Court steps. But could you just tell us, this whole herd mentality, is that a real thing, or is that something that would take 2-3 years to actually eradicate the virus? The herd thing, what is that about?
So the concept there is that you have enough people who've been exposed to the virus and have immunity, that the virus can't find vulnerable people. You know, in other words, if I'm positive and infected, most of the people I meet already have immunity. So if I spread it to them, they won't get it and they won't spread it to somebody else. And, you know, the theory behind that is, and that's how we control most virus infections. You don't have to have everybody in the community with immunity. You just need enough that the virus can't find vulnerable people. And we reckon that you need about 65-70% of the population to have immunity, to get so-called herd immunity, to stop epidemic transmission. It doesn't mean you won't get cases. It's like, you know, you still get cases of measles, you still get cases of mumps, but you don't have a widespread epidemic. Now, if we to rely on natural infection with this virus to get us to herd immunity, it'll probably take 2 years, which is why vaccines become very important.
I'm afraid that's about all the time we have for this segment, Doctor. With this goodbye, we'd love to welcome you back. And I know you're encouraging people to vote for the expansion of Medicaid on Tuesday, because I saw your op-ed piece in the St. Louis Post-Dispatch. We can read that at stltoday.com. Thank you very much, Dr. Powderly, for sharing some of your time with our viewers on this edition of Donnybrook Part 2.
Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you very
sir.
much.
You Doctor.
And thanks, everybody, for joining us. We'll be back next week at this time with another great guest. Stay safe, and don't forget those masks.
Donnybrook is made possible by the members of the 9 Network.